Good evening. My name is Tim Neff, and I'm a Vice President and Director of Museum and Education at Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum. I'd like to welcome everyone to our monthly Spotlight On program. This program takes place the second Thursday of each month, and we encourage you to tune in future episodes, and you can always look back at our archived episodes on our YouTube and our Facebook channel. So if you've missed anything, you can always go back and catch up on these Spotlight On programs. But tonight, I just want to thank you all for joining us. We have a very special program tonight entitled A Civil War Husband and the 100th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. We have a special guest who I'll be introducing here in a minute. And as also will be joining us tonight is our curator, Michael Kraus, who many of you are familiar with as a regular guest on our show here. Before we get started, though, very quickly, a little bit of information about Soldiers and Sailors. In case you don't know about us, we are located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the Oakland neighborhood. It is a building that was built back in 1910 as a Civil War memorial. About 25,000 men from Allegheny County fought in the Civil War. The county wanted to honor these men, and they built Soldiers and Sailors as a tribute to their service in the Union Army. Now, since then, Soldiers and Sailors has become not only a memorial to the Civil War, but also a museum that honors veterans from all wars, Civil War through present day. And our museum is filled with artifacts that have been donated to us through the years by veterans and their families. So if you haven't been down in a while, we encourage you to come visit us. Even if you have been in a while, we always welcome you back and see new things that you might have missed or new things that we've added to our collection. I'll talk a little bit more about how you can learn and visit Soldiers and Sailors at the end of the program, but I hope we see you down at the museum sometime soon. As always, there are the opportunity to ask questions during this program. If you're watching on Facebook, all you have to do is submit a comment, and we'll see that comment and do our best to answer your question at the end of the program. If you're watching on YouTube, you do have to email us, soldiersandsailorspittsburgh@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you with an answer via that email as best we can. So please, if you have any questions, you can post them from Facebook, and we'll get to them, as I said, at the end of the program. I want to introduce our guests today. As I said, first of all, we're very lucky to have Miss Cindy Friend Crytzer. And she is an author of this book, A Civil War Husband. And Cindy is a former educator, event planner, and proud mother and grandmother living in Mercer, PA. She has volunteered with the Mercer Area Library and Historical Society and enjoys transcribing documents for the Library of Congress in her spare time. So I think we've got the right guest with her just from that little bio. And as always, also joining us this evening is Mr. Michael Kraus. Let's pull everybody up here and everybody can say hi. Cindy, you want to just say hi real quick?
Hi everybody.
And Michael, how are you doing this evening?
Good. Trying to keep cool, but doing well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not easy these days around these parts. It's very, very warm here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So it's a great night to hunker down for about an hour and join us and learn all about the 100th Pennsylvania Regiment. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Cindy for the first part of the program. She is going to talk about her book, A Civil War Husband, which tracks her great-great-grandfather, Thomas Nelson, and his service in the Civil War through some of his letters, and we're going to learn about that. So really, without further ado, I'm going to pull the slideshow back up here. And Cindy, I'm going to turn it back over to you to get us started.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Crytzer, and I want to thank Soldiers and Sailors for inviting me here today to talk to you. I'm a retired manager, mother of three, grandmother of three, and as Tim said, I live in Mercer in Western Pennsylvania. And if you would have told me 10 years ago that I would be here in front of you today giving a talk about a book that I wrote concerning events in the Civil War, I never would have believed you. But here I am. So many things in life just fall in your lap from unexpected places and take you on a journey you never expected to take. And this is what happened to me. Growing up, we would attend 3 and 4 family reunions every year. It was just a part of my life. But as the years wore on and the people grew up or got older and passed away, these reunions were coming to an end. Okay, next. And so it was with the Charles and Caroline Mook family. And in 2006, I hosted the last Mook reunion in my home. After lunch, we were discussing the history and shared pictures of the Mook family. And during this discussion, a cousin, Mary Ann Mook Barnum, told us she had letters written by our great-great-grandfather, next, Thomas Donovan Nelson, to his wife and daughters during the Civil War. And this was on top of the letters. And it reads, letters of Thomas D. Nelson to his family, enlisted in 1861, taken prisoner May 6, 1865, and placed in Andersonville rebel prison and never heard from again. His daughter, Caroline Nelson Mook. I had never heard of these letters and was so excited to hear that they even existed. And I was very interested in reading them and talked her into sending me copies. Thus began my 6-year journey into the lives of Thomas Donovan Nelson, his wife, Lydia Jane Fury Nelson, their daughters, Frances, Eleanor, Isabel, Caroline, my great-grandmother, and Anna. After quickly reading the letters, I was hooked. I always enjoyed history, not the dates and places and battles, but the personal story of the history. And here was a great story, and it was in my own family. I decided I wanted to share what Thomas had to say with others in my family. So over the next 6 years, I worked on transcribing and bringing his words to life. I wrote them exactly as he did, including all the misspellings and all the bad grammar. Then I researched what happened to his family when he did not return from Andersonville prison. Next. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey during the Civil War, not your typical journey of battles and casualties or campaigns won or lost, but a journey of one man, one soldier, one father, one Civil War husband. Next. Let's take a step back in time to August of 1861 into a small farm community called Plain Grove in western Pennsylvania. In August of 1861, in Lawrence County, Thomas Donovan Nelson is on his small farm when he hears the call for volunteers to form a regiment to fight in the Civil War. He feels strongly about his country and the abolition of slavery and decides to leave his wife, Lydia Jane, and his 3 daughters, aged 7, 5, and 1 on his call. Next. So on August 31st of 1861, Thomas goes to Harlansburg, Pennsylvania, and with other men in the area, formed the 100th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, and Thomas was assigned to Company E. Their flag lists the battles they engaged in, including Antietam, Fredericksburg, Vicksburg, and the Wilderness, to name a few. General Scott Hancock of the 100th Pennsylvania decided to nickname the regiment the Roundheads. Next. Many of these men were of Scottish descent, whose ancestors were loyal to Oliver Cromwell. He led a British regiment called the Roundheads against King Charles I during the English Civil War. Cromwell's men were called Roundheads because their hair was cut very short, in contrast to the long ringlets fashionable in King Charles I's court. I sometimes try to imagine what it was like for Charles' pregnant wife, Lydia Jane, as she stood in the door with her 3 babies, watching her husband leave her. She knows that she alone is now responsible to care for her children, the house, the farm, the livestock, and the garden. Maybe she is behind her husband's decision to fight in this war. And I imagine she is thinking, surely it won't last long. He will be back soon. Next. This is one of the envelopes containing one of his letters, and it just says, Lydia Jane Nelson, Plain Grove, Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. A couple main themes in most of his letters is discussing letters, those he has sent and those he has received. He talks about money, prayer meetings, and just trying to describe his surroundings, where he is and the people that he meets. Next. Thomas and the rest of the 100th Pennsylvania go to Pittsburgh to muster in and head for Washington, D.C., where they remain from September to October of 1861. Next. And if this was a Ken Burns documentary, the violins would be starting to play right now. This was one of his first letters, and it reads, Calorama, September 28th, Washington City, D.C. Lydia Jane, it is with pleasure I set down to write you a few lines to inform you that I am well And I hope those few lines find you all enjoying the same blessing. I think he starts almost every letter with these same two sentences. I received your letter on the 26th, dated the 23rd. I was glad to hear from you, but sorry that Bella is unwell, but hope she is well by this time. The boys here for bowel complaint use vinegar and salt. It is good. I'm not quite sure if I would follow that medical advice, but it could work. Thomas explains how the guard duty is run, and he tells Lydia that he has gotten all of his uniform except for his coat. And it makes me wonder how in the world all these soldiers were clothed and fed in a timely manner. Thomas was told that there were 3 bakers in the Washington, D.C. area that were doing a booming business, baking for 250,000 soldiers each. Next. Thomas also relates that he's 2 miles from the Chain Bridge, which is a viaduct crossing the Potomac. This is the 6th bridge erected on this spot. The others either were burned, just rotted away, or were taken out with floods. The Chain Bridge in Washington, D.C. today is bridge number 8, but it is built of concrete, so it should stay for a while. Next. An interesting fact that I found while doing research on the Chain Bridge, it was at this bridge on October 12th of 1861 that the Union Army Balloon Corps took its first hot air balloon flight across the Potomac to Lewinsville, Virginia, where it was used to see the positions of the Confederate soldiers. And then they would telegraph it back to the officers on the ground. And I wondered if Thomas would have seen this, but he had already left for Annapolis 3 days earlier. Next. On October 9th of 1861, the Roundheads take a train from Washington, D.C. area to Annapolis. Next. In this letter, he says, we were 48 hours coming from Camp Calorama to Annapolis, a distance of 42 miles. We are now in the state of Maryland. This is a beautiful place. Next. We have houses to live in and everything nice. They are brick buildings that General Butler took from the rebels. They were the United States Navy school buildings, and we are along facing the Chesapeake Bay. It is something new for most of us to see the salt water and the steamships in the sea. I like this place better than any ever I have seen, except for home. At this point, it seems that the Army needs to work on their food supply because Thomas talks about how they have to spend their own money to get enough food to eat. Next. They stay in Annapolis until early December, when the 100th Pennsylvania joins Sherman's brigade and moves by train to Fort Reed, and then arrives in Beaufort, South Carolina by steamer. They join the campaign to capture Fort Walker, Fort Beauregard, and Port Royal. Next. Thomas tells Lydia about the slaves that he met in Beaufort. He was surprised to learn that one slave had 28 children. He also enjoyed eating hoe cakes that the slaves had baked for the soldiers. And the slaves say that if the soldiers will give them guns, that they will fight alongside them on the Union side. Next. In July of 1862, the 100th Pennsylvania moved from Beaufort, South Carolina to Fredericksburg. Next. In his letters from Fredericksburg, Thomas describes what it was like guarding the mothers, wives, and children of the Confederate soldiers that they are fighting. As they march down the main street, they have the mothers and the wives yelling at them. The little children are crying, and the young girls are singing rebel songs as they march along. Next. I included this letter today because it's the only one written on Union paper, and I thought that was kind of neat. In this letter, Thomas says that he has sent Lydia $5 and that she should buy a pair of shoes for Belle, a dress and a bib for the baby, and the rest of it she's to get herself some clothes. So I guess $5 went a lot further back then than it does today. After the 100th Pennsylvania Regiment finishes the battles of Groveton, the Second Battle of Bull Run, in Chantilly, Thomas writes the only letter in this set not written to Lydia. Next. He discusses coming to a bull run the night before the battle, and his regiment is tired, and they decide to wait until morning to move in so they will be refreshed and be more help. Next, when they arrive at Bull Run between 9 and 10 the next morning, the battle is over. He writes, Jackson has done his work and was 1 hour and 20 minutes ahead of us. Although the casualties are much higher, Thomas wrote that they arrived to find 800 Union and Confederate soldiers wounded or dead on the field, and 3 train cars lit on fire. And I can't imagine what a horrific sight that must have been to come upon, and a big loss of provisions with clothing and ammunition that were on those trains. Next. After these battles, they remain in Virginia, where they participate in the battles of South Mountain, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. And this is the monument for the soldiers of the 100th Pennsylvania Roundheads at Antietam National Battlefield. Next. The next station for the 100th Pennsylvania is Covington, Kentucky. While in Covington, they hold brigade markets outside the camp. And the market, he writes, the market lays in front of the regiment. Our field officers set the prices for everything. Next. Then there is a guard to watch that they pay for what they buy. Anyone caught paying more for any article than the fixed price is arrested and sent to the guardhouse. Anyone coming to market with something to sell in the market lines, whether slave or citizen, and refuses to take the fixed price for his goods are seized by the officer of the day and confiscated. There is everything bought here that one can think of. Plate pies for 10 cents, biscuits for 10 cents a dozen, eggs 15 cents a dozen, and a whole chicken cooked and stuffed for 25 cents, which I think sounds like a pretty good deal. Next. The Roundheads move south from Kentucky to Mississippi to gear up for the Battle of Vicksburg. Next. Thomas tells Lydia how desolate this place is. He says that it is hardly worth fighting for. Next. From Thomas's letter of June 23rd of 1863 from Snyder's Bluff, Mississippi, one can get the idea of what it was like waiting to go to battle. He writes, "This is the lonesomest place I have ever been at. We hear nothing here but continual roar of cannons. We get no papers here and don't know what is going on. But the Rebs still hold Vicksburg. But Grant will take it before long. He has been planting siege guns for the last week, and reports says he has 500 guns to bear on the city. I think there will be some hard fighting done by tomorrow or the next day. The 16th Corps marched past us last night with 80 pieces of artillery." And at this point, they also learned that Lee's army is entering Pennsylvania and heading for Gettysburg. Next. After the victory of Vicksburg, the Roundheads marched back to Kentucky a few months before heading to Tennessee. Next. Thomas is sick and taken to Camp Dennison Hospital in Ohio. He was so sick that one of the soldiers writes home that Thomas had died. And he writes to Lydia and says, "You said in your letter that Madison Rogers wrote home that I was dead. I am worth 2 dead men yet. And I don't blame him for writing a willful lie, for there was a great many who thought I was dead and came back to life again." He was well taken care of in the hospital, and he talks about all this food that he got. He got breakfast, and then for dinners, he would get mashed potatoes and chicken and his apple pie that he really liked. In his last letter, dated January 25th of 1864, Thomas is again at Covington Barracks, Kentucky. And he talks to Lydia about many of his in his company have reenlisted, but he has decided to wait until his enlistment period is up. And if he's feeling good, then he's going to get out and come home. But if he's still feeling sick, then he's going to stay in the Army because the Army will take care of him. Next. After a furlough, the 100th Pennsylvania Roundheads are back on the battlefield in May of 1864. On May 6th, during the Battle of the Wilderness, Thomas is captured next and sent to Andersonville Prison in Georgia and never heard from again. It is listed that Thomas died in September of 1864. Next. It is so sad to realize that Thomas made it all the way back to Virginia, but not that last little trip to the end of the war. Next. This is a monument in the cemetery of Plain Grove, Pennsylvania, honoring those who fought in the Civil War. So Lydia last saw her husband in January of 1864. And after he was captured, she gave birth to their fifth daughter, Anna, in August of 1864. With the war ending, Lydia's income also stops, and she applies for pension for her children. And to get this, she had to have soldiers from the 100th Pennsylvania swear that they saw Thomas at Andersonville and that he was so sick that he would never have made it out. She also has to prove that she is Thomas's wife and that his daughters were his children. So she had to get family members to swear to these. She was awarded a pension of $8 a month for her and $3 a month for each of her children, total of $23 a month. After receiving this pension, Lydia finds she still cannot manage to take care of her family on her own. And she hears about schools that the state of Pennsylvania is organizing that might help her children. These are called Soldiers' Orphan Schools. And I had never heard of these schools and decided to learn more about them. Next. On Thanksgiving morning of 1863, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin was at his executive mansion in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Preparations were being made for a fine feast for his wife and Curtin and their 4 children. Suddenly, there is a knock at the door, and standing outside is a small boy and a small girl begging for some bread. Their father had died in the Civil War, and their mother had also died. Next. Curtin decided that even before the war had ended, that a system needed to be set up to care for the children of the Pennsylvania's fallen soldiers. In June of 1864, Thomas Burroughs was appointed the superintendent of soldiers' orphans. Through his efforts, 46 soldiers' orphan schools were established across Pennsylvania to house and educate children from age 6 to 16. Some used existing orphanages and old folks' homes, and others were built new. Some were on farms and some were in the cities. Some of the students who left school went on to college, and others just got jobs or got married. And by 1900, most of the children had outgrown the schools, so most of them had been closed by this time. Next. On January 1st of 1868, Lydia enrolls her 2 oldest daughters, Frances, age 13, and Sarah, age 11, in the Soldiers' Orphan School in Phillipsburg in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and that is now called Monaca. Both girls remained until they were 16 years of age, Lydia leaving to get married, and Sarah went on to attend Edinburgh State Normal School. Now, growing up, I had always been told that Lydia had remarried and her husband did not want the younger children around, so he sent them off to school. Next. When I was doing my research, I found the census records and her grave picture, and Lydia was still listed as Lydia Jane Nelson. So I figured this was just old family stories. However, while researching the military records, I found that Lydia had married 2 more times. And in 1871, she married George McElravy. Next. After arranging for all the pension money to go to him, he sent Lydia's youngest daughters, Caroline, age 8, and Anna, age 6, to the Soldiers' Orphan School in Mercer, Pennsylvania. The middle daughter, Isabel, stayed with Lydia and her new husband. All 4 daughters left the Soldiers' Orphan School at age 16. But according to the old newspaper records, their lives were anything but boring. The oldest, Frances, married William Randolph and lived in Newcastle, Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. And they had 4 children and lived a quiet life. Next. Her husband, William, worked on the railroad, and he loved to take the train up to a lake north of Newcastle and catch turtles. And it was on one of these trips that he was killed in a railroad accident while trying to show off his 26-pound turtle. He was standing between the train cars and was holding up this turtle, and the train lurched and he fell and the train ran over him. William was carried home, but before he died, he asked if his mother would be allowed to come and visit him. And this was questionable if this could be accomplished because 15 minutes before William's accident, his mother was convicted of trying to hire someone to kill the president of Fulton National Bank in Newcastle. She was finally given permission, but William had passed before she reached him. Frances and William's oldest son, Shannon, led a hard life and grew up well known to the police in Newcastle for drinking, stealing, and fighting. This could stem from an incident from his youth. When Shannon was 11, he witnessed his 6-year-old friend being shot in the head by a teenager who had just bought a gun for 75 cents at the corner store, and he was trying to show off. That would be tragic for anyone to see. And of course, in those days, they didn't know how to treat trauma. Next. Their daughter, Ella, grew up to be the only woman butcher in the United States. She won a $10 gold piece in a contest in Pittsburgh, competing against 12 men. She claimed the first 10 years were the hardest, and after that, one seldom cuts one's fingers. Thomas and Lydia's second daughter, Sarah Eleanor, went on to get a teaching degree from Edinburgh State Normal School and taught for a while at the Mercer Soldiers Orphan School where her sisters attended. She married William McIlvaine, an attorney, and lived in Findlay, Ohio. She and William had 2 daughters, and they were only 4 and 2 when their mother died in childbirth. Their next daughter, Isabel, was the only one of Thomas and Lydia's daughters that did not go to this soldiers' orphan schools. In 1880, census shows her living with her mother, Lydia, and Lydia's second husband. It shows Isabel as having 2 children by then. The census lists Isabel as George McElravy's stepdaughter, but her children are listed as his nieces. Isabel eventually marries Horatio Rash Caldwell. Rash turns out to be a good nickname for him. Their tranquil marriage ended with these headlines. Next. Steubenville was treated to a sensational murder in which Horatio G. Caldwell shot and killed Amos Weems, alias Turkey. It happened after a night of drinking. Rash and his friend Turkey Weems go to Rash's home, where Rash is so drunk he passes out, and Turkey tries to assault Isabel. The next morning, which happens to be Easter morning, when Rash finds out what happened to Isabel, he goes to his neighbors and steals a gun and hunts down Turkey, and he shoots him. He is sentenced to 12 years of hard labor, and Isabel dies while he is in prison. Next. Caroline Nelson, my great-grandmother, Thomas and Lydia's 4th daughter, was only 2.5 when she saw her father for the last time. After leaving the Mercer Soldiers Orphan School, according to the 1880 census, Carrie is a servant in Venango County, Pennsylvania. Next. During this time, she met her future husband. No, back one. I'm sorry. She met her future husband, and they lived in the Titusville area their whole married lives. This was the home that Charles had built for them. Of the 11 children born to Charles and Carrie Mook, only 6 lived to adulthood, one being their youngest daughter, Iris, who was my grandmother. Thomas never saw his youngest daughter, Anna, and it is not clear if he even knew that she had been born. In fact, I didn't even know that Anna existed. She was never mentioned in any of the letters that I had. But in reading through Lydia's obituary, I found that she lived with her daughter in Wellsville, Ohio, a Mrs. L.D. Miller. And I wondered which daughter that was. And in the Ohio census, I found that her name was Anna and Hannah, but I was still confused because none of the girls had that as a first or a middle name. I finally found her name in some old family papers, and it said in 1880 census that she was residing in the Mercer Soldiers Orphan School. So I went to the Mercer Historical Society, and then Director Bill Filson brought out some boxes of information on the Soldiers Orphan School. Next, and we began to dig, and after a few minutes, Bill said, "Here she is." And I thought, here I am holding a picture of my great-great Aunt Anna, who I didn't even know existed 2 weeks before that point. While not all soldiers' orphan schools were great places to live, next, Mercer must have been a very good school. The alumni formed the Sixteeners Club in 1891 and held annual reunions in Mercer. And these weren't just little dinner affairs. These were whole weekends with officers elected and programs planned. Next. They made decorations, pins, address books. Next. And at their 35th reunion in 1926, the Sixteeners placed a plaque in memory of the Mercer Soldiers Orphan School on the Mercer County Courthouse. And that is still on the courthouse today on the north side. Next. In 1895, Anna marries Lorenzo Miller, and they lived in Wellsville, Ohio, where they ran a grocery store and a meat market. They later bought the Metropole Hotel, the picture on the bottom, and her husband is brought before the court many times for liquor violations, and once for having his saloon open on a Sunday and for scrubbing out and running the filthy water over the sidewalk and into the gutter. Next. After Lorenzo and Anna retire to Florida, Anna becomes an early member of the Daughters of the Union Veterans of the Civil War. She serves as president and treasurer of the Cornelia Boyd Turney, tent number 3. And next. And in closing, I'd like to say, in writing this book, it became very evident to me that no matter what war, when that soldier walks out the door towards battle, their life and the lives of everyone around them changes forever. The soldiers must adjust to life in a strange place, performing duties they never dreamed of. And their families must adjust to life without their spouse, their parent, or child for a short while, or as in this case, forever. How the lives of Lydia, Frances, Sarah, Bella, Carrie, and Anna would have been different if Thomas had returned from the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. That was wonderful. Great insight into the life of a soldier, but also the effects of what happens to the family afterwards, which I do not think gets as much attention as it deserves, because obviously families were ripped apart by these situations. And I'm glad that you were able to highlight that. And, obviously a very interesting history for a lot of the family members after the war was over. So thank you so much. Remember, if you have any questions for Cindy, you can post them on Facebook, and we'll answer them at the end of the program. But we are going to shift gears right now, and we're going to look at some of the artifacts that Soldiers and Sailors has related to the 100th Regiment. And Michael's going to tell us a little bit about, really, most of this features Captain James McFeeder. So Michael, do you want to take us away and take us from here?
Sure. Thank you, Cindy. That was wonderful. And like Tim said, I always find the hole that's left after a soldier doesn't come home, like how that really changes the dynamics of a family. And, I think you were really correct in saying we wonder what would have happened if he would have come home and raised those children with his wife. Certainly would have been very different. But we're going to look at, we're lucky enough at Soldiers and Sailors to have some pieces from the 100th Regiment, the Roundheads. And I was chatting with you earlier that the Roundheads are a particular favorite of mine because I grew up in Lawrence County in Newcastle, and that's where the majority of the regiment was raised. They were raised in Lawrence, Butler, Beaver, Washington, Westmoreland, and Allegheny County. So they had contributions from many counties, but a majority of it came from that Lawrence, Butler, Mercer area. So McFeeters is an Allegheny County man, and he is in company. What company is he in? I think he's in company M, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't write down what company he was in, but he was an immigrant. He was from Ireland and joined the Roundheads the same time that Thomas Nelson did in August of 1861. He, however, became an officer. He was a lieutenant and subsequently a captain. Was wounded several times during the war, very badly at Bull Run. You talked a little bit about Bull Run. This would have been the second Bull Run in August of 1862 by a piece of shell that hit him in the head. How do you survive that? Well, it must have just grazed him, but it was a wound nonetheless. We have, let's go to the next slide. We're lucky enough to have his uniform, and that was given to us by his wife in shortly after Soldiers and Sailors opened in 1911. McFeeters died in just previous to 1911, and at that time, Soldiers and Sailors was new, and they weren't really soliciting artifacts, but people would bring things to Soldiers and Sailors, and they were kind of put in these display areas. So this, not only being a Roundhead artifact, it's one of the oldest pieces we have in our collection. So that's his coat. It's called a frock coat. It's a regulation Union Army line officer's frock coat, which is a single-breasted coat, 9 buttons, and his insignia captain's bars are on these patches called shoulder straps on his shoulder. We have his sash and belt as well. And on the right is a really unique piece. It's his identification pin. Soldiers did not in the Civil War get dog tags, and many of the soldiers who were killed were unknown. If you go to Gettysburg and walk through the National Cemetery, you'll see row upon row of markers that just say unknown, unknown, unknown. And soldiers, this was something that nobody really thought of. A lot of times if someone was killed, they were buried by their friends during the battle or right after, and a marker maybe with their initials carved in it was put next to it in an attempt to mark the grave. But soldiers came up, vendors came up with an idea, and soldiers quickly caught on to it, and that was purchasing private identification pins or corps badges or identification pins. And this one is McFeeters. So this was something he would have purchased from a vendor. These sutlers that set up in camp, or you could order them through the mail, through newspaper. There's lots of ads in newspapers at the time of people selling these. And it says Captain J.L. McFeeters, and it's spelled wrong. It's Feeders, and it might have just been phonetically the way he told the guy, and the guy wrote it incorrectly. Company M, so there's our company, 100 PVV, and if you look in between the company and the M, there's a little engraved insignia of a cannon and an anchor, and that insignia is the insignia of the 9th Army Corps, to which the 100th Pennsylvania belonged. And it was a direct throwback to General Burnside, who was from Rhode Island. And those elements are found, the anchor especially is found in the Rhode Island flag. But the other thing that's interesting about it is when you look at PVV, 100 PVV, normally the regiment was called, our regiment was called 100th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. And Cindy, you talked about Thomas, when the regiment was had an opportunity to re-enlist, and he was going to make up his mind whether he was well enough to or not. Well, that happened in Tennessee for the 100th Pennsylvania, and in those days, regiments were raised for 3 years, and at the end of the term of service, which happened to be right in the middle of the war, or towards the middle end of the war, it came to mean that a lot of veteran soldiers who had been fighting for a while would be dismissed. And that's exactly what the Union Army needed. They needed these guys who, they didn't need them to be dismissed, they needed them to be fighting. So they offered him a 30-day furlough. If the majority of the regiment would reenlist, like 2/3 of them, they would all get a 30-day furlough, and they would get the designation veteran volunteers. So the 100th had enough men that signed on for the next 3 years. They went home. That may be when he saw his wife last, when he went home in January of I think it's 64.
Right.
Excuse me. And then they returned back to Tennessee and followed the route that Cindy pointed out. But they also re-recruited. They went back and they filled up the ranks with more men, and it became a full-size regiment again. So it's when you see that VV after Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, New York, that means it's a veteran regiment that re-enlisted, which is kind of an interesting little fact. We could go to the next slide. We have more than just McFeeder's uniform jacket. We have a couple other pieces, and this is a pretty unique piece. This is also a private purchase piece. When I say that, that means, soldiers were issued certain pieces that were regulation, like they were supposed to wear the cap with the little visor and with insignia, but they could, especially officers, could private purchase pieces. And this is more of a civilian type hat. Today we call it a pork pie in our collecting and Civil War terminology, which means it has a very short crown and a short brim. It has cords. Those cords signify an officer. And boy, it's just got the most beautiful bullion embroidered horn. Now, was he a musician? No, he wasn't a musician. He did play the fife, and we have his fife, but he was not a musician in the regiment. The horn insignia was the insignia that the Army used for infantry. So that tells us it's an infantry officer, and there's the 100 right in the middle of the bend in the bugle. And what's really unusual about it is it's backed with a little piece of light blue cloth for infantry. Most insignia that we see, officer insignia, does not have, it's rare to have the number in it, embroidered in. Sometimes they were applied in, but I've only seen two, and both of them were from the 100th Regiment, Pennsylvania, with the light blue in the center. So this is a pretty rare piece to accompany the coat that we have too. We can move to the next slide. We have his canteen. So he must have come home and kept a lot of his stuff. His wife, thankfully, instead of throwing it away, decided to give it to us, and we still have it. But his canteen is the regular federal issued ovoid canteen. You can see the rings in it underneath the cover. Those are reinforcement rings that keep the body. A lot of times in battle, people would fall on their canteen or lay on their canteen. And if it didn't have that reinforcing, it could crush. So that's something that came about during the war years. And the sky blue cover is actually the cover color of the enlisted man's trousers and overcoat. And those covers were made at arsenals out of spare cutoff parts from uniforms. And it's really in the collecting Civil War world, that sky blue kersey cover is the most coveted because it really rings with federal infantry colors. On the right looks like a purse, but it's a haversack. Enlisted men were issued a haversack that was tarred canvas, and the haversack is where you carried your eating utensils, your plate, your comb, your pen, your paper. It's kind of your everything bag, your everything that you need bag. And McFeeder's is an officer's version made of leather, and it's pretty amazing to have survived. There's a small pocket on the outside, and inside has two different pouches, again, for eating utensils, plate, maybe Bible, diary, anything he needed that he didn't want to get lost. Because if it was in your backpack, lot of times they had to push their backpacks away when they were going into battle, and they would lose everything. But the haversack is something that a soldier wore constantly. So he would have everything that he needed in his daily life in that haversack. Next. We have at Soldiers and Sailors, Tim mentioned there were 25,000 soldiers from Allegheny County, and around the museum area on the outer walls in the building are these large plaques, and they're arranged by regiment. And we see here the 100th Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. They contain the names of men who were recruited from Allegheny County. So you're not going to get every man in the regiment. And you'll see, like, if you look at Company F, there's only 2 guys, 2 or 3 men. And that's only because they're Allegheny County men. And we've kind of enlarged the Company M place that shows James L. McFeeters in his Allegheny County origin with us. Next. We have that jacket is on display, and what we feature about his time in the service is his participation in the Battle of the Crater. And unfortunately, Thomas wasn't there, Thomas Nelson, because he had been captured at Wilderness in May of 1864, and the Battle of the Crater is going to happen in July of 1864. The Union Army was entrenched, and the Confederate Army was entrenched in a stalemate near Petersburg, Virginia. And there was an attempt made to break through those defenses by a kind of interesting plan. Some miners from Pennsylvania proposed that they could dig a mine tunnel from their lines all the way under the Confederate lines and blow up the Confederate lines. And then they could, in that surprise, be attacked. Well, that did happen. The United States colored troops were supposed to lead that attack. Ferrero, commanded by General Ferrero, but at the last minute, General Meade thought that it wasn't a good idea, that they would be sent in because they were fresh troops and they didn't have the experience. So he had the commanders draw lots, and General James Ledlie, who commanded the 9th Corps, had the shortest straw, and so the 9th Corps was going to attack the area that would be blown up. So that the miners dug the trench. They put tons of explosives under it, black powder, lit a fuse. It blew up. There was some confusion. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, almost 5, and they didn't take immediate advantage over what happened. It took them a while to get ready, and when they crossed the plain between the two sides and entered, they were supposed to go through the broken line and go north and south up through the trenches and take the lines, but they ended up going into the hole, which was called the crater, that was made, and the Confederates were kind of ready for them, and they started shooting at them and kind of indiscriminately killing. It was a disaster for the Union Army. They lost 3,800 men, and the Confederate Army only lost 1,200 at the fight. But particularly for the Roundhead Regiment, they got stuck right in the middle of it. They went right in. They went into the trenches. They got surrounded. Many of them were captured. Many of them were killed. And McFeeters was in there. And he talks about, we have this great archive of material from the Grand Army of the Republic. And in it are sometimes members would fill out their war experience. And we were lucky enough to have McFeeters, in his own words, talk about what happened to him at the crater. And he talks about the explosion where he felt the bayonets of 2 rebels. They were that close. They were going to bayonet him. And he couldn't see his way out. I could not see my way out, but determined on defending myself as long as I could. For in that engagement, they took no officers alive as prisoners on account of the colored troops fighting with us. So the Confederates, they would, with the Union association with the black troops, was a death sentence if you were wounded, the Confederates were particularly aggressive in killing, or especially black troops, but officers they were searching for, and that was kind of a rough deal for officers. You could be killed for just having the association with the black troops, the United States colored troops. So he says he knew his fate because he was about to be bayoneted, but the timely bullets of 2 Spencer rifles from my own regiment dropped both of them. And one of them fell over me, but I lost no time in freeing myself. So 2 of his men who had Spencer repeating rifles saw what was going to happen, and they killed the 2 rebels that were going to bayonet McPheeters. The boys saved me. And he says, I declare I must have jumped. Each step was 25 feet as they ran out of there to make their escape. And he says, I was in command of the regiment that afternoon. We lost all the officers who were my seniors, a lieutenant colonel, a major, an adjutant, 2 captains. My orderly sergeant was taken prisoner, and all the company officers, he said, who were taken were shot. I was almost trampled to death in the retreat. I was trying to do my best to hold them in line to receive the rebel charge that was coming at us, but broke and rode me down. When I got up, I saw the 2. He's kind of repeating himself, that the Rebs meant business. The reason, so he escapes, McPheeters escapes, but these 5 men, these 5 Roundheads, did not. McPheeters mentioned that the lieutenant colonel was killed. That's Hamilton on the left. He was acting lieutenant colonel. Richard Craven, well, let me go to the middle. Leisure, this is Samuel George Leisure. He's the son of the colonel who was not present at the battle. Samuel George Leisure was killed there. His body was never recovered. William Oliver on the right was a captain of Company B. He was killed. These are all within 10 or 15 yards of where McPheeters was. Richard Craven, who had been a teacher before the war, was killed alongside of this soldier, Hugh McCune, who's an enlisted man. Both of them, there's an eyewitness account, both of them were killed by the same explosion of a shell, Confederate artillery shell, that blew up over their heads and killed both of them at the same time. So the Roundheads lost in that one afternoon, and it was a disaster. I mean, it provided no gain. The Union Army retreated. Nothing was won there. 64 Roundheads were casualties. 22 of them were killed. So it was one of the worst fights that they were in, and very close to the end of the war. These guys that had survived from August of 1861, and the war is going to last only another 6 or 7 months, but this was a really bad thing for them. And like I said, McPheeters managed to escape. We could have easily had his picture there too, but luckily he escaped. Do we have another photo, Tim?
No, that's, I think, the end of what we have here, Mike. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. And you can see those objects on display at Soldiers and Sailors. And I don't see any questions coming up here, but I do want to have a little shout out here like I try to do. Thank you, Paul Lawson. As usual, you're one of our regular viewers. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Susan McMichael. Looks like you have a fan, Cindy Susan McMichael, said that you did a wonderful job. So I wanted to share that. And thank you, Susan, for tuning in. And hopefully you tune in to future programs. As always, I like to kind of try to wrap up here with some information about visiting Soldiers and Sailors. You know, the museum is open Monday through Saturday, 10 to 4. I do always recommend checking our website, soldiersandsailorshall.org, just to confirm that the hours are correct, because some days for special events we have to close, and that's always listed on our website. But you can always walk in during those times. You can also call ahead to schedule a guided tour of the museum, about a 90-minute experience through the museum with a guide. Our next event for our tabletop gamers, if you've tuned in, you've heard about them. We have a military gaming club that meets at Soldiers and Sailors once a month, and we'll be meeting this Saturday, July 15th, to play games related to Gettysburg. So anybody out there who may either themselves or know somebody who's interested in military board games, it's a great chance to meet others that are into it. And we have welcome all ages, all experience levels, and we get together and play board games related to the military. And this month we'll be focused on Gettysburg. And you can learn more about that and all our programs at soldiersandsailorshall.org. And next month, which will take place on August 10th, our Spotlight On program will be about the United States Coast Guard. Maybe one of the lesser talked about branches of service. And we have several objects, of course, in our collection related to it. And we'll also have a Coast Guard veteran joining us for that program as well to talk about his service. So that's what we'll be looking forward to next month. But with that, I want to bring us all up here and just say thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Michael. You guys were wonderful. Lots of great information. Thank you, everybody out there, for tuning in. Like I said, you can always watch these at any time on our Facebook and YouTube pages. We have every Spotlight On archive that you can watch. So please tune in and check us out. And I hope that we will see you next month. Hope we see you at Soldiers and Sailors. And Cindy and Michael, you guys want to say goodbye to everybody, and we'll get out of here.
Thank you, Cindy. That was very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.